I remember the day I arrived at the Aldermore estate, with a clarity that still makes my hands tremble. The carriage wheels crackled over frost-bitten gravel as we passed the wrought-iron gate, its bars twisted like blackened bones. Fog coiled around the trees like something alive, and even the air felt reluctant to let me pass. The mansion revealed itself slowly, a silhouette behind mist and dying branches. It wasn't just a house, it was a presence. The windows stared down at me like cold eyes, and the rooftop gables jagged into the sky like crooked teeth. This wasn't an ordinary home. It was a haunted mansion, with a reputation soaked in whispers. People in town still crossed themselves when its name was mentioned. I had returned not to inherit, but to understand a dark legacy, why every Aldermore son died exactly on his 21st birthday, and why my own was only months away. Inside, the house reeked of secrets, the scent of old wood, wax, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. I could hear the ticking of an unseen grandfather clock echoing through the foyer, as though time itself was trapped here. Dust lay thick on the chandeliers and picture frames, yet not a single spider dared make a web. The silence was unnatural. As I stepped deeper into the grand hallway, my footsteps sounded muffled, like the house was trying to smother every noise. I paused under a massive oil painting, my great-grandfather Richard Aldermore. His eyes seemed to follow me, sunken and accusatory. It was under his rule, they say, the curse began. That same year, his firstborn son collapsed on the eve of his 21st birthday, bleeding from the mouth with no wound. A family curse, they whispered, though no doctor, no priest, no scholar had ever been able to prove or break it. I unpacked slowly that evening, the cold seeping through the walls no matter how high I turned the radiators. The house was alive, and I felt like an intruder in a body not my own. Outside, the wind began howling, low and guttural like it was carrying voices. The mirror above the fireplace had a crack through its center, and though I knew better, I could swear my reflection smiled a moment too late. I knew then that this place would not allow me to leave untouched. The Aldermore estate had claimed its sons before me, and it was watching now, waiting. My heart sank as the ancient bell in the tower rang once, then twice, marking the hour. I was home, and the countdown to my 21st birthday had begun. The next morning, I wandered the eastern wing of the estate, drawn by an unnatural pull, as if the house itself guided my steps. There, beyond a pair of heavy oak doors that hadn't been opened in years, I found the portrait hall, a long corridor cloaked in dust and shadow, stretching farther than the architecture should have allowed. My boots echoed against the marble floor, yet each step felt swallowed by the velvet silence. On both walls hung massive oil portraits, generation after generation of Aldermore sons, all painted in their prime, none of them older than 21. Their expressions varied, some smiling faintly, others serious or afraid, but all shared the same hollow eyes, the same strange flicker in the corners of their mouths. These were not just paintings, they were memories nailed into canvas, haunted portraits the townspeople had once called them. And as I stood in front of them, I realized something even more disturbing. Not a single daughter, mother or sister was shown, only sons, only the marked. I reached out to touch the painting of Elias Aldermore, the first son to die in 1831. My fingers hovered just above the cracked varnish, but some force pushed cold air against my skin. A warning. The plaque beneath his frame read, Elias, aged 21 years, his life a whisper. The next portrait, dated 1853, bore the same message. Nathaniel, 21 years, he heard the whisper too, and so it went, down the line, every son, every death, every year spaced almost precisely a generation apart. The Aldermore curse wasn't just coincidence, it was ritual. The deeper I went down the hall, the harder it was to breathe. The air grew thick and smelled of linseed, mildew, and something else, something burnt. I stopped in front of the final portrait, Julian Aldermore, My father's younger brother. He had died just before I was born. His expression was different, not fearful, defiant, and next to him, an empty gold frame waited, untouched, gleaming, ready. My name was carved faintly into the wood. As I stood frozen before my unfinished portrait, I felt a draft sweep the corridor, not from a window, but from behind the wall itself. A low sound followed, a hum, almost musical, almost human. I turned, but there was no one there, yet the eyes in the paintings felt sharper now, alive in a way I couldn't explain. My hand trembled as I backed away, and the moment I crossed the threshold out of the hall, the heavy doors slammed shut behind me, sealing the past and future inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just disturbed something that was never meant to be touched. This was no mere hallway. It was a tomb of inheritance. The Aldermore sons hadn't just died. They had been taken, claimed, frozen in time before the house could let them go, and now it had turned its gaze fully to me. It was just past midnight when I first heard them, faint at first, like wind threading through cracked walls. But as I sat alone in the study, the fire dwindling to red embers, the whispers grew more distinct. Not words exactly, more like suggestions of words, childlike tones stretched and warped as if spoken underwater. I followed the sound up the main staircase, past the long shadows thrown by candlelight, until I found myself before a pale blue door with peeling paint, and a brass knob gone dull with age. I hadn't noticed this room before. The air outside it was colder, stagnant, and carried the faint scent of powdered chalk and lavender. On the door, in tiny carved letters, it read, "The Nursery." No one had stepped inside this room for over 40 years. I pushed open the door, and was met with a sudden wave of warmth, like a breath had escaped from within. The nursery was frozen in time. Toys lay arranged neatly on shelves. A rocking horse sat mid-swing, and faded wallpaper peeled in curled strips from the corners. The crib, small and ornate, was still made, its linens yellowed but undisturbed. Dolls with glass eyes stared blankly from corners, and a mobile of paper stars dangled silently above the crib. Yet despite the stillness, I could feel a presence. Something unseen moved just behind the air. Then I heard it, clear as anything. A soft, high giggle, not playful but hollow, mechanical. I turned sharply. Nothing. But then from the corner near the curtains, the music box began to play on its own. A slow, sad tune, one I didn't recognize, but that made my stomach twist in sudden grief. This wasn't a nursery. It was a shrine, and it was still inhabited. I took a few careful steps inside and saw etched into the wooden floor with a child's hand dozens of tally marks. They ran in rows toward the crib. Kneeling down, I counted them. 21, again and again. 21, scratches in one cluster, then another. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, and nearly stumbled into the rocking chair which suddenly began to sway. The whispers grew louder again, but this time they were angry, urgent, as if warning me away. I slammed the door shut and held it, breath heaving in my chest. Behind it, something knocked, once, twice, then silence. As I backed away, I realized the painting beside the nursery door was of a child I didn't recognize. A small boy, face pale and bruised, eyes blackened as if from weeping. Beneath it, the name was scratched out. But I understood now. This nursery didn't belong to a child that lived here. It belonged to the one who never got to leave. The curse hadn't always waited for 21. Sometimes it came far sooner. The following morning, I found Aunt Beatrice in the solarium, sitting like a statue among dying plants. She hadn't aged so much as she had withered, bone-thin wrists resting on the arms of her chair, white lace gloves, hiding her translucent skin. Her eyes, however, were very much alive, sharp, knowing, and cruel in their stillness. She'd lived at Aldermore longer than anyone, the last relative on my father's side who hadn't vanished or died screaming. They called her the widow ghost in town, though she had never married. I wasn't even sure whose sister she was. She just remained. When I greeted her, she turned her head slowly, as if my voice had echoed from a place she'd almost forgotten. "You look like Elias," she said without smiling. "That same look of dread, though you still hide it better than he did." Her voice scratched like parchment being torn. I asked her directly about the curse, about the sons, about why every Aldermore male seemed to be marked for death on their 21st birthday. She said nothing at first, just stared through the glass as though watching ghosts play in the garden. "It's not a curse," she whispered finally. "It's a promise. Your great-grandfather made it, and none of us have had the courage to break it since." I pressed her for more, but she shook her head, hands trembling in her lap. "They always ask too late. By the time you're willing to believe, the house already has your name." Till when I mentioned the nursery, her face changed. Her body stiffened like a sudden cold wind had passed through her bones. "You shouldn't go near the child. He's still learning his place." I didn't ask who the child was. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Before I left, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "The house listens, darling. It watches, but it doesn't forget. Every lie it hears, it carves into the walls." Then she leaned closer and whispered something that made the blood drain from my face. "Don't sleep on the third night. That's when the house decides if it wants to keep you." I pulled away and left her in the garden of dying ferns, where she began humming that same strange tune I'd heard in the nursery. As I walked back through the corridor, I looked at the wallpaper and noticed something I hadn't before: scratches behind the floral print, like tiny letters carved into the plaster. They read, "He's not done choosing." That night, I locked my door and didn't sleep at all. I found Elias's diary in the West Library, behind a false panel, in the lowest shelf. I wasn't looking for it, just running my fingers along the spines when something clicked, and the small door creaked open like it had been holding its breath for years. Inside, wrapped in linen, blackened with dust, lay a leather-bound journal. The initials EA were etched into the cover in gold, now faded to a sickly bronze. I opened it with hesitation. The pages were brittle and yellowed, stained by what looked like water or tears. His handwriting started neat, meticulous even, but by the middle of the book, it had turned frantic and jagged, like someone writing under duress. Too, there were passages crossed out with thick slashes of ink, entire pages torn out, but what remained painted a picture darker than I ever imagined. The first few entries were innocent enough: descriptions of the estate, notes on tutors and fencing practice, admiration for his elder brother, who had died young. But then around his 19th birthday, the tone changed. He began to hear things. "Voices in the walls," he wrote, "not dreams. They whisper when I'm alone, and when I'm not." He wrote about footsteps that followed him into rooms, candles that refused to stay lit, and reflections that moved just slightly out of time. Then came the drawings, dozens of them, all of the same image: a tall black figure with a blank face and outstretched arms, each one more distorted than the last. "The Watcher," he labeled them. "He waits at the third-floor landing. He never speaks, only listens." My heart pounded as I read that. I had passed that landing more than once, and I had always felt watched. The final entries were rushed, desperate. They lied. "It's not a curse. It's a feeding. The house takes us one by one." Another page. "They knew. Father knew. He said it was a family duty, that every line must be paid for with blood." The last line before the pages ended was scrawled in shaking ink. I can hear him at the door. "I am not ready. I am not ready. I am not ready. I am not ready." The sentence trailed off into a rip, and the paper was torn down the middle. I closed the book with trembling hands. For the first time I didn't feel like a guest at Aldermore. I felt like a replacement, a name carved into a long list. I stayed in the library for hours after that, afraid that if I opened the door, something would be waiting on the other side. something that had already come for Elias, and now knew my name. I found the funeral records in a lacquered chest beneath the chapel floorboards. The Aldermore family chapel stood near the edge of the property, half swallowed by ivy and rot, its windows long since blackened by soot or sin, maybe both. I don't know what compelled me to go inside that day, but something in the wind seemed to direct me there. The moment I crossed the threshold, the scent hit me: dried lilies, wax, damp earth, and beneath it all, a metallic tang: iron, blood, time. I opened the chest expecting hymnals or altar cloths, but instead I found a bundle of documents wrapped in velvet ribbon, brittle and stained, and beneath them a dried bouquet of jet-black rose petals, perfectly preserved. The name on the funeral sheet struck me like a blade: Cornelius Aldermore, died 1802, aged 21 years. This was the beginning, the first death, but what unsettled me more was the note written on the back of the document, in what looked like a woman's hand. He did not die. He was taken, buried, breathing. I stared at those words until my eyes burned. The burial was described in detail, far too much detail. It spoke of closed casket ceremony, of crows circling the sky at exactly the moment the coffin was lowered. Guests complained of an unbearable heat, despite it being winter. The preacher who led the service quit his post the following day, and reportedly went mad. But the strangest part, there was no death certificate, no recorded illness, no wounds, only one line from the coroner's notes: eyes open, mouth sealed shut with something black. I stood above the chapel's crypt entrance for a long time, staring at the iron ring used to lift the stone slab. Something deep in my bones screamed not to open it, but I did. The scent of mold and earth was overwhelming. Steps descended into darkness slick with age. At the base, rows of narrow coffins lay tucked into alcoves. Most had names, but some were blank. When I found Cornelius's, it was marked not with his name, but with a single symbol, a circle with 3 slashes through it. I don't know what possessed me to place the dried black rose petals on the lid. Maybe I thought it would quiet whatever still stirred within. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, faint but clear, a muffled knock. Once, then again, from inside the coffin. I ran. I didn't look back. And even now, I wonder, was it his soul still trapped beneath the stone, or something else that never belonged in the earth at all? It began with a sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, too heavy to belong to anyone still living. I woke to them echoing down the corridor just past midnight, exactly the same hour Elias had mentioned in his diary. The entire house had fallen into a choking silence, yet I could feel a pressure in the air, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something to return. I followed the noise, barefoot, candle in hand, down to the unused servants' hallway near the west wing. No one had stepped foot in that passage in decades. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, torn where damp had eaten through, and the air tasted of rust. Then, from behind a locked door at the very end, I heard it, a voice, muffled at first, then rising into unmistakable blood-curdling screams. They weren't just cries of pain. They were pleas, choking, desperate, words I couldn't fully make out. But the name Samuel came through clearly, repeated over and over. Samuel Aldermore, the second son, died in 1817. His portrait in the hall had always struck me as odd. He looked terrified even while painted. Shaking, I forced open the warped door with my shoulder. The room behind it was cold as death. It was a former guest bedroom, untouched, but not undisturbed. The bed was shredded, the mirror shattered, deep gouges carved into the walls as though something had tried to claw its way out, and on the floor, where dust should have gathered, were prints, bare feet, fresh. I stared at them as the candle flickered wildly, and the air shifted. That's when the screaming began again, this time directly behind me. I turned and saw no one, but the scream went on, impossibly loud, as though tearing through the house itself. I dropped the candle. Darkness swallowed the room instantly, and the scream distorted, low and guttural, not human anymore. I stumbled back, trying to escape, but the door slammed shut and refused to budge. The walls pulsed with sound, and in that moment, I understood. Samuel hadn't simply died. He had been broken by the house, by something that came for him, and would not stop until it fed. When I finally escaped, whether the door opened or the house allowed me to leave, I fell to the floor gasping. Behind me, the scream had stopped, replaced by soft weeping, like that of a child. That night, I didn't sleep. I listened, and I wrote in my own journal. The house replays their final hours like music. It feeds on memory, and soon it will want mine. The crows began appearing after the third night. At first just one perched on the rusted chimney top, head tilted unnaturally, watching me from high above as I stepped outside for air. Its feathers weren't black, but a sickly, oil-slick sheen that shimmered in dull grays and greens, like rot under sunlight. Then more came. 5, then 13, then 21, always 21. They never cawed, never flew away. They just watched. I tried to ignore them, but their silence felt heavier than screams. On the 5th morning, their droppings appeared in symbols, long spirals, X-shapes, and the same circle with 3 slashes I had seen carved into Cornelius's coffin. It wasn't random. It was ritual. By noon the crows had begun circling the house in slow, lazy loops, never breaking their pattern, never shifting from their invisible orbit. Indy reminded me of vultures, but worse, they weren't waiting for death. They were announcing it. The house had started reacting too. The floorboards groaned in protest beneath my feet even when I stood still. Paint peeled in the shapes of faces. The fire wouldn't catch, no matter how much wood I added, and each morning I woke with dirt under my fingernails. Though I hadn't stepped outside, the air had turned metallic again, like the breath before a thunderstorm. And in the hallway beneath the attic, I found feathers, not fallen, planted, lined neatly across the doorway in a perfect crescent. I hadn't opened the attic yet, but the crows watched it more than they watched me. On the 6th night, I dreamed I was buried alive in the garden, and above me, crows pecked through the soil, as if counting down. I awoke choking on dirt, real dirt, packed into my mouth. My sheets were torn, and feathers were stuck to the sweat on my back. I ran outside, desperate for air, and looked up. They were still there, perched, waiting. One by one, they began to tilt their heads in perfect unison, as if receiving some unseen command. I screamed at them, threw stones, but they never moved. Only one responded. It opened its beak and dropped something onto the steps. A yellowing tooth, not animal, human. I stood frozen, heart thundering. The house had begun speaking through them now. The question was no longer if I would die at 21. It was how the house planned to make it happen. I turned 21 in silence. No celebration, no visitors, just the chiming of the long-forgotten grandfather clock at midnight, ringing out 21 slow, agonizing tolls. Each one felt like a final heartbeat. I sat in the drawing room, fully dressed, a single candle flickering beside me. The fire had long since died, like everything else in this house that tried to burn. I had not slept for 2 days. Aunt Beatrice had stopped speaking altogether, seated now like a corpse in her garden chair, staring at nothing. The crows no longer circled. They disappeared that morning, as if their work was done. The house was waiting. It knew the date, and I no longer had the strength to pretend I didn't believe. The temperature in the room dropped with every hour. Doors creaked open by themselves. Windows refused to shut. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the candle blew out, not by wind, but as if something exhaled beside my ear. The room was plunged into darkness. My reflection in the nearby window remained visible a moment longer than it should have. Then I heard the music, that same slow broken tune from the nursery's music box, only now it echoed through the entire house, and beneath it, footsteps, not stomping, not shuffling, deliberate, slow, and approaching. I stood back pressed to the wall, too afraid to call out. Then came the voice, low, male, and horribly familiar. "We all come home." It wasn't from outside, it came from inside me. My mouth had moved, but it wasn't my voice. I stumbled backward into the hallway, candle shaking in my grasp. The lights flared to life one by one as I passed, guiding me toward the eastern staircase, the oldest part of the house. I knew then what Elias must have felt, that strange pull, that sickening certainty that there would be no escape. My chest tightened, my heartbeat felt unnatural, like someone else's rhythm had been stitched into mine. I reached the stairwell, and found it lit. At the top stood a figure, tall, faceless, robed in shadows. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I understood. This was the same being Elias had drawn again and again. The Watcher, the one who came for every son. But this time I stepped toward it. I had to know if I was the next offering, or if there was still time to break the pattern. 21 steps to the top. I counted each one, and when I reached the last, the figure was gone, but the air was full of breathless voices whispering in unison, "You are not the last." Every estate has one door no one speaks of. This was ours, set behind a false wall in the west wing, wrapped in dust and forgotten architecture, was the room that had remained locked for generations, and Beatrice never mentioned it. No blueprint of the house acknowledged its existence, but I had seen it, once in a dream, and once again in Elias's diary. Behind the wall with no breath, there lies the wound. It wasn't until my 21st birthday that I found the key, buried inside a hollow piano leg in the ballroom. The key was rusted, heavy and warm to the touch, not metaphorically warm, truly warm, as if it had been sitting in someone's palm only moments before. I held it for hours before I built the courage to use it. The lock gave way with a sound like bones breaking. The door opened inward, revealing a chamber unlike any I had seen in the house. Stone walls, arched like a crypt, candles had melted to their bases decades ago, their wax petrified in long rivers down the walls. Chains hung from the beams, not rusted, but polished, recently used. The center of the room was marked with a ring of symbols, the same circle with 3 slashes, surrounded by faint reddish stains that told their own story, and in the back corner was a small wooden chair, facing the wall. On the seat, a leather-bound journal, not Elias's. This one belonged to Richard Aldermore, the patriarch who had started it all. The book was smaller, but thicker, and full. I turned the pages with dread. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Dates, names, ritual notes, descriptions of each Aldermore son's final day. One line kept repeating, "The house requires balance. Blood seals the name. Blood preserves the name." My hands trembled. I read that Richard had made a pact, some unholy agreement made long before the estate was built, back in 1782, in exchange for prosperity, protection, and long life for the rest of the family line. The firstborn male of each generation would be offered at the age of 21, willingly, if possible, forcefully, if not. The room I stood in wasn't just a prison, it was a sacred place to the house, a place of offering. That's why it remained locked. It wasn't to keep people out, it was to keep something in. The journal's final page was blank, until I touched it. Then words bled up through the page as if written in invisible ink. "He is awake now, and he knows you will not give yourself freely." I dropped the book, the walls groaned, and behind me the chains began to sway. The twins were always whispered about in fragments, never directly spoken of, never named, no portraits, no graves, not even an entry in the Aldermore family ledger. But I found them by accident, as if they were waiting to be remembered. It was in the attic, behind old sheet-covered trunks and crates of rotting books. A narrow door, child-sized, led to a room I had somehow never noticed. Inside, 2 iron-framed beds sat parallel, inches apart, with tiny indents in the pillows, as though 2 heads had only just lifted from them. The walls were covered in strange chalk markings, symbols I couldn't translate, but they repeated in a rhythmic pattern. And on one bed, resting like an offering, were 2 identical marionette dolls, handmade, unblinking, arms tangled in red thread. The room reeked of sleep, stale breath, lavender, and something more sour underneath. Scattered around the beds were notebooks, pages torn and filled with what looked like sleep logs. Awake 4 nights, one entry read, "Still watching, still here." Another, "He walks in when our eyes close." The twins had written in alternating handwriting, frantic and circular, recording every time they tried to sleep and what they saw when they did. One page was soaked in something brown and flaked, blood or ink, I couldn't be sure, and read simply, "He doesn't want just one of us, he wants both." Beneath that, a crude drawing of the watcher, but with 2 faces this time, one smiling, one blank. Aunt Beatrice later confirmed what I feared. The twins died before their 21st birthday, but not from the house. They refused to sleep, for 21 days straight. She said she used to hear them pacing in unison at night, chanting together under their breath, "Stay awake, and he won't find us. Stay awake, and we stay whole." On the 22nd day, both were found in their beds. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no cause of death, just peaceful expressions, and both holding one another's hands, like they had finally surrendered. Beatrice had found them herself. She had never entered the attic again. But after I opened that door, something changed in the house. I began hearing 2 sets of footsteps outside my door at night. Not heavy, not dragging, just soft, like children tiptoeing, but always in perfect sync. And once, while drifting into sleep, I felt 2 cold fingers press lightly against each of my eyelids, whispering, "Don't open, just rest." I didn't sleep for days after that. I understood now. Some sons didn't make it to 21, not because they escaped the curse, but because they knew what waited at the end, and they chose another way. His name was Mr. Alcott, an old man with milky eyes, a spine bent by years of servitude, and a voice like torn paper. He had served the Aldermore family since the days of my grandfather, and for as long as I could remember, he never spoke unless spoken to. But the night after I found the twins' room, he came to my door. I hadn't summoned him. I hadn't even known he was still alive. He stood there in his frayed black uniform, holding a silver tray with nothing on it. "It's time you heard it from someone who didn't die first," he said, stepping into my room without waiting. I followed him in silence, sensing something sacred or sacrilegious was about to surface. He didn't sit, just stood near the fireplace, staring into the ashes that hadn't burned in days. "I was here the night Richard Aldermore made the first bargain," he began, voice steady, like someone long prepared to confess. He thought no one was listening when he spoke into the empty nursery, but I was, hidden, afraid, and I heard everything. He said Richard hadn't been speaking to God, or even the dead. He was speaking to the house, whispering promises, sacrifices. The bargain was simple. Every generation, a son would be offered on the night of his 21st birthday. In return, the house would remain standing. The Aldermore name would never die out. Wealth, safety, power, legacy. But what Richard didn't understand, what none of them ever did, was that the house wasn't simply a vessel, it was alive, and it remembered everything it was fed. Mr. Alcott paused then, trembling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pocket watch. Inside was a photo, cracked and faded, of a boy. "My son," he said, barely audible. He was to be a stable hand, not one of them. But when the family lost a son too early, they needed another. I stared at him in horror as the pieces clicked together. They fed the house, someone who didn't belong to the bloodline. I asked. He nodded. The watcher accepted him, but the balance broke, and ever since the house has begun choosing for itself. My chest grew cold. That explained the twins, the screams, the voices in walls. Not all who died here were born Aldermores, but once the house tasted their blood, it kept them. I asked Mr. Alcott why he never left. His answer was simple: I buried them. I heard them scream, and I still hear them. Every night. Leaving wouldn't change that. He left without another word, but as he passed he dropped something into my hand. A rusted key with the word cellar carved into it. If you want the truth, he said, go below, but know this, whatever you wake down there may not let you return. I found the letter inside a hollowed-out book in the study. The book was titled, Fathers of the Republic, a thick, dusty volume no one had touched in decades. As I flipped through its yellowed pages, one spread felt oddly thick. That's when I saw it. 2 pages glued together. I peeled them apart slowly, and inside was a folded letter, stained with age, sealed with a wax crest I barely recognized. The crest wasn't our family's. It was older, sharper, more primitive, a claw gripping a flame. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the brittle paper. It was addressed to Thomas Aldermore, dated October 12, 1824, 1 week before his 21st birthday. The handwriting was erratic, rushed, no greeting, no sign-off, just pure panic in ink. They lied to you, Thomas, your father, your uncle, even the priest who blessed your christening. The house was never a gift. It was payment, a blood price for what Richard Aldermore did in 1782. He opened a door that should never have existed, and now it expects more than you can give. The letter went on to describe vivid hallucinations, waking nightmares, and a shadowy presence with no face that would appear at the edge of Thomas's vision as his birthday drew closer. He watches from the mirror, never fully seen, but always there. When you sleep, he leans in. When you breathe, he breathes with you. You are not dying. You are being collected. The most chilling part, however, wasn't the warning. It was the revelation of what came before. The writer claimed the Aldermore house was built on land taken from a congregation that practiced ancient burial rituals, rites that preserved not bodies but souls, forcing them to remain bound to earth. When Richard raised their church to build the estate, he disturbed something sacred, something sealed, to keep the house from consuming everyone. A pact was made, one soul from the bloodline. Every generation must willingly pass on the 21st year. Willingly. That was the word repeated in shaky lines. If he must chase you, the house takes more. If you go freely, it sleeps. But Thomas never got the letter. I know because the envelope was still stamped, unsent, no address, no return. Whoever wrote it must have hidden it out of fear or guilt. And Thomas, he died on the stroke of midnight. Heart failure, they said, peaceful. But now I knew the truth. He hadn't been taken in ignorance. He had felt it coming, dreamed of it, begged for answers. And this letter, it was his only hope. My stomach turned as I imagined him pacing his room, alone, watching shadows stretch toward him, never knowing someone had tried to save him. Too late, always too late. That night, I slept with the letter beneath my pillow, not for protection, but because I wanted to feel what he felt. And as I drifted off, I swear I heard a voice, muffled, right beneath my bed. You read it. You know now. He'll come faster. It began with a power outage. A storm had rolled in without warning. Sky split with violet lightning, trees bending like mourning widows in the wind. The estate lost all power just after dusk. I wandered into the drawing room, looking for lanterns, and found only a single candle resting in a brass holder on the fireplace mantel. It was already lit. I didn't light it. The flame danced too steadily for the storm outside, too bright. Still, I carried it to my room, feeling oddly comforted by its warmth. But that feeling faded fast. Within minutes of closing the door, the air went thick and wrong. The flame wasn't burning down. It was climbing. The wax was crawling upward like a white snake rethreading itself. The wick, instead of shrinking, grew longer. My eyes refused to believe it at first, but time inside the Aldermore house never played fair. I sat frozen, watching as the candle unmelted itself, returning to its pristine form before my eyes. The shadows in my room twisted unnaturally, the corners darker, the mirror fogging, without breath. Then something worse. My clock began ticking backward. The hour hand wound in reverse, faster and faster, until the ticking became a blur, like a buzzing insect spinning in circles. And with each reverse tick, I felt lighter, like pieces of memory were being scraped from my mind. I struggled to remember where I was, why I was there, who I had come with. Names slipped away, like water through fingers. Only the candle remained sharp in my vision, glowing brighter with every second erased. Then I saw them, reflections in the mirror, that did not move as I did. They were versions of me, younger, more innocent, standing behind me. One was no older than 10, clutching a toy I'd forgotten I ever had. Another was 16, his eyes hollow, mouth trembling. Each reflected a year I had lived, and they were all watching the candle, waiting for it to reach the end of its climb. I panicked. I blew out the candle, but instead of smoke, a scream burst from the flame, a child's scream, echoing and unnatural, like it came from under the floorboards. The reflections vanished. My breath caught. The candle snapped in two, fell to the floor, and turned to ash on contact. I scrambled to the mirror. My reflection was back, but its lips were still moving, even as mine stayed shut. "You're almost 21, it whispered, in a voice not mine. "Soon you'll be reversed too." I turned from the mirror and ran to the hallway. Everything was still. The power had returned, but in the corner of the room, a new candle had appeared, tall, white, unburned, waiting. I didn't touch it. I didn't sleep. But when morning came, I checked the mirror again. My reflection had caught up, but something behind my eyes hadn't. It started with a draft, cold, sharp, and unnatural, rising through the floorboards of the east wing. I'd been walking the corridor alone, my candle low, when I heard it, a faint creaking sound beneath my feet, not of wood, but of something hollow. Curious, I tapped my heel twice. The sound echoed strangely. I returned the next morning with a crowbar and pried up the warped floor plank. Beneath it, hidden under a thin crust of dirt and rotted linen, was a small iron ring, a pull handle. I hesitated, then I yanked it. A square hatch lifted, revealing a stone staircase spiraling into blackness, no wider than my shoulders. The air that spilled up from it smelled of iron and earth, and something fouler, something faintly sweet like decay masked with perfume. I descended with a lantern, gripped tight in my hand. The stone was wet, slick, as if the walls had been weeping for years. The staircase went deeper than the foundation should have allowed, 40, 50, maybe more steps, until at last I stepped into a narrow tunnel, carved directly from the bedrock, crudely reinforced with timber beams. The ceiling sagged low, and old ritual markings, scratched rather than painted, lined the walls in strange patterns. Some were runes I'd seen in the Elias Aldermore diary. Others were just shaped spirals that bled into circles that broke apart into jagged lines. The tunnel was deathly quiet, except for one sound, a slow rhythmic drip, coming from ahead, steady as a clock. Each drop echoed, but not against the walls. It echoed inside me. I kept walking. I found the source of the dripping in a chamber about the size of a root cellar. At its center stood a stone altar, stained black with old blood. Above it, hanging from rusted chains, was a decayed animal carcass, half goat, half something else, its skull elongated unnaturally, jaw dislocated wide open. Beneath the altar, bones, hundreds of them stacked in twisted arrangements, children's bones. The moment I stepped closer, the walls began to breathe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tunnel expanded and contracted, as if the very earth had lungs. My lantern dimmed, and I heard it again, that familiar voice from my dreams. But this time it didn't whisper, it spoke plainly, from behind the altar. You've come farther than they did. The others were too afraid. I spun around. No one, just shadows curling around the walls like smoke. Then, from the farthest corner, a tunnel split off from the main chamber, newly exposed, as if the earth had shifted to reveal it. Fresh footprints marked the dust, mine, and one set ahead of me, barefoot, smaller. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. Something told me if I entered that passage, I wouldn't return, so I turned and climbed back up, shaking. But the moment I emerged, the hatch slammed shut behind me on its own. When I turned around, the iron ring was gone, just floorboards again, no sign of the door. But in my palm, I still held a chip of the altar stone, cold and wet with something that wasn't water. And that night, I heard footsteps beneath my bed, stone against stone, walking slowly, upward. There was a mirror in the west hall, I'd always avoided, not because it was cracked or eerie. On the contrary, it was pristine, perfectly polished, framed in old brass with floral etchings, and untouched by time. But it never seemed to gather dust, no matter how the rest of the house decayed. One morning, I passed by it, and froze. I wasn't reflected. The hallway behind me was clear in the glass, lit softly by the grey morning light. But where I should have stood, there was nothing, just a gap in space, as if I were invisible. I moved closer, my breath tightening. I waved my hand, reached up to touch my own face, but in the mirror, there was no movement at all. The hallway stood still and empty, like I had never existed in it at all. I touched the surface. It was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. Then I blinked, and in that split second of darkness, the mirror changed. I was suddenly there, but not as I was. My reflection looked aged, worn, hair unkempt, skin sunken, and eyes that were not mine, blackened at the edges, ringed with rot. I stepped back instinctively, but the reflection didn't. It remained pressed forward, its hand flat against the glass while mine had dropped. I watched it for a full minute. Then too, it smiled. I didn't. It tilted its head slowly, watching me, studying, and then it mouthed a single word, soon. I turned and ran. I refused to look into that mirror for the rest of the day. I even draped a sheet over it. But at night, I woke up to a soft sound in the hallway, fabric tearing. When I crept out, heart pounding, the sheet was on the floor, shredded, as if ripped from inside the mirror. This time, I didn't approach. I simply watched. The reflection now mimicked the hallway perfectly again, except one thing was missing. My room. In its place, a wall. I stepped left. Nothing. Stepped right. Still nothing. It was like the mirror showed a version of the house without me in it. A world that had moved on. Or maybe, a world where I never belonged in the first place. As I turned to leave, the lights in the hall flickered. Then for a split second, I caught a dozen reflections behind me, all different versions of myself, each aged, each whispering soundless words, and not one of them blinked. He turned 21 just past midnight. We didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. We both knew what came next. James, my only sibling, my anchor, had been different from the others. He laughed louder, dared to question the house more than I ever had. But as the night approached, his voice grew quiet. Shadows clung to him differently that day, like the house was already measuring him for burial. He stayed in his room, refusing food. I heard him crying behind the locked door, whispering to himself, "It won't take me. I won't let it." I sat outside, back against the wall listening. The air felt heavier by the hour, charged like before a storm, but there were no clouds in the sky, just that still, suffocating heat that wrapped the estate like a warning. At exactly 11:59, the house made a sound I had never heard before, like wood weeping, every beam moaning in unison. I rushed to James's door and found it open. His room was empty, just the window wide and the curtains fluttering like wings. But I knew better. He wouldn't run. Not him. I searched the halls in a panic, lanterns swinging wildly. Then I heard the sound piano keys, slow and deliberate. The drawing room. I bolted, and there he was, sitting at the grand piano. None of us had touched in years, playing a haunting melody I'd never heard before. His back was to me. I called his name. He didn't turn. I walked closer, and stopped cold. His hands weren't touching the keys. They hovered inches above them. The music still played, but not from the piano. It came from somewhere beneath us. Suddenly the house groaned, and James turned to face me. His eyes were black, not metaphorically, but truly black. No iris, no white, just void. His mouth opened, and a deep inhuman voice echoed out, "You were warned." He stood, or rather floated, and began to rise from the floor. I screamed his name, and ran to him, but my hands passed through him like smoke. His body began to split at the chest, bone by bone, without blood, just silence. And then he was gone. Not crumpled, not dead, just erased. The piano stopped. All that remained was a deep dent in the floor, where he had stood. I fell to my knees, shaking. The clock struck midnight, and the wind outside began to howl. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even breathing. I just whispered, "Now I stummed the last." The family cemetery lay just beyond the orchard, forgotten, overgrown, and rarely visited. 21 headstones, each with the same surname, each engraved with different sons, different dates, all dead at 21. I stood before the oldest grave first. Samuel Aldermore, 1791, 1812. He'd been the first. No one ever spoke of him, not even in whispers, but I needed to know what had truly happened. If the curse was just story, or something worse. I returned that night, with a shovel and a lantern. The moon was low, red like a fresh wound. My hands trembled, but I dug. Dirt crumbled like old bread, dry and light. No roots, no stones. It was as if the earth wanted me to reach him. I hit the casket, around 3 feet deep. That was wrong. Too shallow. The wood was soft to the touch, moss-covered, and nearly hollowed by time. I pried it open carefully. The lid came apart like paper, but inside was not a skeleton. It was empty, not decayed, clean, no remains, no fabric, no dust, just a heavy layer of black feathers, perfectly laid out, like lining. They gave off a rancid scent, old blood, iron, and something sour. I stepped back, nausea rising. I moved to the next grave, then the next, all the same, empty. Every casket opened, revealed either rotted feathers, or dirt shaped like a body, but no bones. It was as if the bodies had never decayed, because they'd never stayed. Something had taken them, reclaimed them. At the grave of my father, Charles Aldermore, I hesitated. He had died silently, with no warning, slumped in his chair, in the study on the night of his 21st birthday. I opened his grave with shaking hands. The coffin was sealed tighter than the others. I pried the lid open with the rusted end of my shovel. But this time, there was something inside. Not his body, but a mask, carved from bone, shaped into the exact likeness of my father's face, eyes hollowed out. Beside it was a rolled parchment, sealed with wax in the shape of that same triple-slashed circle. I opened it and read the first line. For the last Aldermore, you are not cursed. You are chosen. I read the parchment by candlelight in the ruined chapel behind the manor, the only place that still felt distant from the house's pull. The script was old, shaky, written in what looked like dried rust, though I suspected it was blood. It wasn't a letter. It was a ritual, a list of duties, a confession, and worst of all, a binding. It told of a pact made in 1749 by the first Aldermore Matthias, who had come to these lands not seeking fortune, but power over death itself. The family line had been traded to something beneath the earth, beneath the house. Each firstborn son would be given 21 years to live freely, and on the final day, return to the pact, their soul as payment to preserve the others. That's why every Aldermore boy died at 21. It wasn't coincidence. It was collection. But there was more. One son in every 7th generation was not to be taken, but instead transformed, made into the new binder, the keeper of the cycle, the one to renew the pact and oversee the harvesting, the caretaker of the entity beneath the manor. The writing ended with a name. Mine, signed in advance, beneath an empty date line. I felt my vision blur. Rage, horror, betrayal. My father hadn't died to save us. He had willingly gone, offered himself, and prepared me for the role without ever telling me. All those nights he kept me close, the locked rooms, the stories he discouraged. It had all been part of grooming me for the task. I wasn't his legacy. I was his replacement. That night, the house spoke, not through voices, but through the walls themselves, groaning, creaking, doors swinging open in unison. A cold wind swept through the halls, and I could feel something waking below. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive, and its heart beat beneath the floorboards. I followed the wind to the basement, then deeper, into the root cellar. I had always been forbidden to enter. The lock was already broken. Inside was a stairway that led to a door carved from stone. My hand shook as I pushed it open, and the air inside was ancient, thick, warm, metallic, and from the darkness, I heard breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic, something waiting, something expecting me. I realized the final gift of the Aldermore legacy wasn't land, but servitude to something older than death. I stood before the stone chamber, its breath colder than winter, its scent a rotted sweetness that clung to my skin. The air felt thick, like water pressing against my lungs. Inside, the walls pulsed faintly, alive. This place wasn't just beneath the house. It was the house, the heart of the Aldermore legacy, the heartbeat of the thing we had served for generations. I stepped inside, lantern raised, and saw the floor was littered with shards of bone, each carefully arranged in spirals and circles. In the center, a stone slab, stained black by centuries of blood. Carved into it was the symbol I'd seen all my life, 3 intersecting slashes in a broken circle. Only now I understood. It wasn't a family crest, it was a brand. Then I saw them, faces, not living, but pressed into the stone walls like wax impressions, dozens of them. My brothers, my father, even the ones I never met. Their eyes followed me, their mouths slightly open, silent, but watching. I staggered forward. Something from the dark ceiling above me began to lower itself. A shape, massive, hunched, cloaked in shadow. It had no clear form. Flesh merged with stone. Feathers grew from bone. Limbs bent in wrong directions. But what gripped me most were the eyes. Hundreds, blinking all at once, none fully human. And they were inside me, seeing through me. It didn't speak aloud. It didn't need to. Its message was in my veins. You were bred for this. You belong to us. Fulfill the pact, or join the forgotten. I fell to my knees, choking on my own breath. My body pulsed with heat, as though blood had turned to ash. The mask I found in my father's grave appeared before me, hovering, then slowly lowering itself over my face. I screamed, but no sound came. The mask fused, not glued, not strapped. It became my face. Pain like fire consumed me, but I didn't die. No, I changed. My thoughts fractured into whispers, into memory fragments not my own. I saw centuries of rituals, sacrifices, the first boy who screamed as the pact was sealed, the birth of the thing we fed. I was no longer just myself. I was them all. And when I woke, I was lying in my father's chair, just as he had been, the house silent, still. My reflection in the glass showed a hollow-eyed figure, something between man and ghost. The house had chosen. The cycle was safe. I understood now. I wasn't the last Aldermore. I was the first of the next cycle, and someday some distant child would dig my grave, only to find it empty. The curse doesn't end. It simply waits.